Of all of the high rollers added in Gran Turismo 7, this one was probably one of the most significant, maybe even the most, in terms of potential usability compared to its historic status as a collector's car. The Porsche 917K, of course, in its iconic Gulf colours. Not only is this a fantastic livery base to work from, but also it is a justified legend in the racing world, not the least of which at Le Mans. Now, one of the great things about the car is you technically, and this is pretty rare for a high roller, you can technically try before you buy when it comes to the 917. As with a couple of other cars that you can drive in the music missions, for example, in the main menu, this one you can test in the license section. Because as many of you will probably remember, this is that much maligned final mission in the S category license. Now, I will say, it's not really ideal conditions to drive a 917 in, because it's a, 50, 60-year-old race car being driven in the rain at Spa. That's kind of the point of the mission. But it does still remain as a chance of driving the car before you pay the 18 million credit price tag to potentially own it. And that, of course, is when I bought it. It tends to go up and down depending on the Hagerty Collection, so it could well be more or less as time goes on. Now, what do you actually get for that money? What's the tunability? Is it actually any good for racing? We're going to touch on all of these points that I always like to, especially with expensive cars. So first of all, what is it like for tunability? Well, it's kind of good and bad. See, it's bad in terms of being able to upgrade it because there's really nothing you can do. You can't even fit it with NOS, you can't upgrade the power, of course you can't drop the power, and it already has racing tyres, so changing it up to mediums or softs makes a fairly negligible difference in terms of the point level. So what you get is pretty much what you get, and what you get in this case is just over 750 points, which on the one hand is quite reasonable if you think about it. That's only 50 points higher than the kind of cars that we use to earn money in the Le Mans Cash Cow event. So 50 points higher isn't really that much for such a legendary race car. So what do you get for the money? And what do you get at that level? Well, actually, something really cool, because it only weighs 800 kilos on the dot and it has a hair under 600 horsepower. Now, although you can't improve the power, of course you can restrict it, and more importantly, you can add ballast to bring the weight up to a cool metric ton, 1,000 kilos. Now, what that means in practice is that quite literally, with a very minimal amount of tuning, and I'm actually doing a tune in the coming days on the channel for just this, you can literally run this car with full power and racing hard tyres as a cash cow in the 700 point event at Le Mans. It's bang on 700 points. And with that setup, even using the 4-speed gearbox, you can get 190 miles an hour out of it. It will do 3 laps between pitting in, and the handling, although 50, 60 years old, is actually surprisingly good. Maybe that rain driving in the S mission paid off, after all, because I personally don't find it to be any worse in wet conditions than any generic supercar, even one of the cars that I like to use the most for this event now, which is the SLR McLaren from Mercedes. Another car which I absolutely love, but it's not necessarily the best thing to use, and yet this is about as quick as that around the track, around the lap, with less power, less torque, and still a lot more weight than the 917 started out as. So not bad at all on the surface of things. So yes, it's good and bad. Bad in terms of not being able to get 700, 800, 900 horses, which is unfortunate, but great in terms of ironically making it slower, because it's a really useful car when you make it slower. Now, on top of all of that, you can drive it without buying it, you can detune it and make it an absolute weapon at the 700 point level, especially on circuits that allow for its straight line speed, and even if you decide to keep it as a collector's piece, well, of course it's one of the ultimate legends in the game. It's a car that many of us have wanted for such a long time in Gran Turismo, and I would say overall, now that it's here, I actually do think it lives up to the hype. If you go into the 917 expecting this to be what Forza, for example, would have made the car like, well, as much as I love Forza, their performance stats are all over the place. So a car like this would be untouchable. And technically they do have a version of it. They've got the longer tail version of the 917, and it's a tremendously fast monster of a car, like 275 miles an hour with a V12 engine swap. But in this game, it's far more realistic to how quick it roughly should be, at least with 600 horsepower, and that actually makes it a combination of really useful, but also it feels authentic. It's definitely not a forgiving car, but I would say it's not the worst of things to drive either. It can be leery and it can bite back, but it's a Porsche. At the end of the day, what do you expect? It's also a race car at the literal top of the pack, up there with Grand Prix cars, in 1970. So you cannot expect for this to be the easiest thing to drive. Even with that being said though, it is definitely not the hardest thing to drive either, and I would actually go so far as to say, as controversial as this might be, I actually find this to be a more useful car than some of the newer Porsche prototype racers, as iconic as they are as well. So ultimately, I would actually say that this is one of those high rollers where, despite the massive price tag, at least at the moment, I would actually say that yes, it is worth buying. Not the least of which on top of all of that, because it really is a gorgeous canvas to do liveries on. But for those who do disagree, absolutely, tell me down below if you find the car to be a disappointment once you bought it. Maybe is there another event that you found it to be like a sleeper hit for? So ultimately that's it for this vid. Of course, stick around for that tune that I'm going to do. If you do own the Porsche and would like to maybe pay for itself at Le Mans, that will allow you to do so. And until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.